In order to be a modern day fantasy reader, it's almost a prerequisite to have read some of Tolkien. Most likely Lord of the Rings, maybe a little bit of The Hobbit, but one way or another, if you're into or getting into reading fantasy, at some point someone will ask you, have you read Lord of the Rings? And then if you say no, the follow-up question is always, why not? And then the follow-up question from there is, what are you doing? When are you going to read Lord of the Rings? Why haven't you read it? I'll be the first to admit that Lord of the Rings fans, myself included, can be a little bit intense when it comes to one of the most loved fantasy series of all time, and one that arguably started the fantasy genre as we kind of know it, at least as we know over the last 70 years or so. Give or take, Lord of the Rings isn't quite that old, but it's almost that old. So today, as a huge lover of the Lord of the Rings books by J.R.R. Tolkien, I want to give you 5 tips for introducing yourself to the world of Tolkien, reading tips for how to approach this series that can be somewhat intimidating by some. One of the reasons why so many people stay away from Tolkien is that the book is very, very long, which is somewhat ironic because a lot of other fantasy series are just as long and their books are sometimes even longer. Think Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson or The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. Maybe there's just a Brandon Sanderson theme here. Regardless, the length is one of the reasons why so many people shy away from Tolkien. And that's actually the first tip I'm going to give you today, is Lord of the Rings should be experienced as a journey. I'm going to keep quoting Brandon Sanderson and say, journey before destination. And that really is how the Lord of the Rings feels. Most of the people who read through the series don't just power through it in a week or two. Some people do, there are some crazy people out there, but most people take anywhere from 3 to 6 months to read the book, maybe longer. Now, Lord of the Rings is technically 3 books, but the author wrote it as one entire book. Thankfully, the publisher made it a little bit more digestible by breaking the Lord of the Rings into 3 published books that we know now: The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. And each of those books is broken into 2 books in and of itself, just called Book 1, Book 2, Book 3, Book 4, Book 5, and Book 6. That does make the reading process a little bit more digestible. So that's my first tip. Read the book slowly. Take your pace and enjoy it. Savor the scenes, savor the characters, savor the scenery. There's a lot of scenery in this book. In some chapters, the scenery just tends to go on and on forever. If Tolkien were to write Lord of the Rings today, he would absolutely be asked by his editor to cut out a bunch. And rightly so for a modern day book. If this was written nowadays, there's a lot that wouldn't necessarily need to be there. And although it's sacrilegious for me to say this to the Tolkien community, that's just the way it would be in today's publishing world. Lord of the Rings was not published today. It was published in the 50s. And fantasy as a genre was not really established. So Tolkien got away with a lot of things that wouldn't make the cut in a book today. And that is to its advantage in a way, because we don't see books that are quite as meandering as Lord of the Rings is. Now, Lord of the Rings does have a very focused plot and knows what it's doing. It has characters that have goals and motivations and conflicts and desires and all the good stuff we want in a story. But the beginning of the story does feel a little bit meandering. Even though the characters know where they're going, Tolkien has them go on almost like a little bit of a walking party in a way in order to get to the first stage of their journey, to have that first stage of their journey completed. And that's one of the benefits of Lord of the Rings. You don't have the benefit in most good fantasy works these days to really get a sense of the adventure, the journey, without all this conflict raining down on characters. And Tolkien writes it in such a way that makes it a world we want to enter. He writes the scenery in such a way that we want to embrace and say, yes, this is a world that I want to go to. And ironically backs up the story by saying this is a world we want to see saved as well. So some of that meandering bits that Tolkien's good friend and fellow author C.S. Lewis called basically a walking party, those are bits that I would encourage you just to anticipate, but also to savor, because they do add a lot to the journey and they make the world realistic, and it makes it almost like a heartwarming world. The world feels real, don't get me wrong. It doesn't feel like this cuddly fantasy world. A lot of crap goes down in this book, but those early bits that do seem a little bit meandering, I just encourage you to read them for what they are, embrace them. Don't try to rush through them if you can help it, but just know that's part of the journey. Ultimately, with that, I just encourage you to see the world as a character. The world of Middle-earth is just as much of a character as any of the other characters, the humans, the elves, the men, the dwarves, the hobbits in this world, which really leads me to the next point in understanding why Tolkien wrote the story that he did. Now, Tolkien was really caught up with the fact that Great Britain, the country he was from, did not really have an established mythology that was native to Great Britain itself. Great Britain was influenced by a lot of French folklore and mythology, and there's very few British specific mythology that is specific to Great Britain, Jack and the Beanstalk being one of the main exceptions. And Tolkien was beside himself about this. So what he really set out to do was to kind of create an alternate mythology for Middle-earth being the world of the Lord of the Rings. And he's saying this is an alternate version of how our world came to be. This is an alternate version of the history and mythology of Great Britain. Now, we never see in Lord of the Rings a point where we see the characters say, okay, now here's the transition to England as we know it. That doesn't happen at all. Don't worry. It's not that cheesy. But Tolkien does want us to say, okay, if 1,000, 2,000 years ago, Great Britain's history, which is a little bit muddled, this is something that could have happened. These are the events that could have led up to that, with the elves being present, the dwarves being present, and the men really taking over as kind of the prominent race in Middle-earth, and eventually that becoming the world of Great Britain as we know it today. I promise it's not as weird as it sounds when I put it that way, but this really was Tolkien's passion. He was, again, beside himself with the fact that Great Britain did not have a deep mythology, and this was his way to correct that. The next tip I want to encourage you with is enjoy the small moments. Now, there's some great, epic, bombastic moments in this series, really this book. We call it a series. It's mistakenly called a series. We do it wrong all the time. It's one big book, but there's a lot of great moments. There's battles and there's creatures and there's just epic moments, but there's also a lot of small moments. And that's one of the things that The Lord of the Rings does really well, is it takes these great characters, it puts them into small character moments where they're forced to really have agency and really come to terms with who they are as a character and what they must do to further their journey and care for those that they love. And there are a lot of those moments sprinkled throughout the story. So I think a lot of modern day fantasy, you wait for those big moments and those big reveals. And I'll be honest, Lord of the Rings, while it has some amazing scenes, it's not a twisty story. There are not too many twists and turns in the plot. There are some, don't get me wrong, and the ones that are there are set up very, very well and they make sense with the characters' journeys. But the heart of Lord of the Rings is really in the small character moments, and seeing some characters who may almost seem like minor side throwaway characters at first really come into their own and change the course of the story and change the course of the lives of those that they love. So when a character seems like almost baggage for a moment, stay with them. Know that their moment is coming, and that moment may be one of your favorite moments in the entire story. Another point that I want to forewarn you of is to prepare for lots of walking. This is one of the ultimate walking adventures. There is a lot of walking in this story. As you probably know, the characters are trying to take this one ring, this ring of power that has the power to destroy the world, basically across a whole continent to destroy in a volcano. And they have to walk to get there. And there are a lot of other moments, as I said before, that are interspersed with that walking. There's battles and there's horse charges and there's great character moments, but there's a lot of walking. And that ties into my point from earlier where they see a lot of scenery, and Tolkien describes the scenery and he describes the walking. So just be forewarned of that. There is going to be a lot of walking in this story. But again, enjoy those small moments, enjoy the dialogue, enjoy the descriptions. Tolkien's descriptions are second to none in a lot of ways. Tolkien's really painting a picture in our mind that is really a breathtaking picture in a lot of ways. Sure, he uses a lot of words sometimes to say what he has to say, but it's worth it in the end. Which ironically leads me to my next point, which is don't feel like you need to enjoy everything. So many Tolkien fans, again, I'm guilty of this too, will say, what, you didn't enjoy the walking scenes? You didn't enjoy the scenery scenes? How could you? And that's okay. It's okay not to enjoy certain elements of it. If you don't like the walking, if you don't like the scenery, don't beat yourself up about it. I would just encourage you to enjoy the story for what it is, enjoy the parts of it that you do enjoy. And if you don't like certain parts of it, don't feel bad about it. Don't let the Tolkien community beat you up about it. And I will say the Tolkien community is generally very, very nice and encouraging and polite about such things. I think I can speak for a lot of us when I say we just want people to experience the story one way or another. And if you don't enjoy certain parts of it, that's fine. This is coming from a person whose favorite fiction book of all time is The Lord of the Rings. And although it pains me to say there are parts of it that you might not like, there are parts of it that you might not like, and that's okay. There are a lot of characters, a lot of events, and a lot of moments that happen in the book that are, I think, worthwhile. That if there are certain parts of it that you don't like, that's fine. Off the top of my head, I can think of 2 or 3 parts that I know catch people. There's a part at the beginning of Fellowship. There's a part at the beginning of The Two Towers that are just slow and meandering, and a lot of people quit during those parts. And I'm not going to say what they are because I don't want to spoil them for you, but I do want to encourage you to at least power through the slow chapters because the story does progress. And again, it's one of the best slow burns of all time. So many people I know get to the end of the story, and even though there's parts of it they may not have liked, especially in the first book, they're just crying at the end of it because the story is just so emotional. It hits you in all the feels. There's this sense of sadness that permeates throughout the story, but that's the kind of sadness that's cathartic that almost makes you happy. And I can't explain why without spoiling the story. And I promise you the story does not end in a doom and gloom, grimdark fashion at all. It has a very good ending that is a bittersweet ending that is cathartic, and it's one that moves so many people. If you've seen the movies, you know what I'm talking about. The book feels just the same way at the end. And if you haven't seen the movies, you're in for a treat at the end. And finally, if you need a guide for the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring, I have a playlist I'll link here that has a chapter by chapter kind of analysis for each chapter in The Fellowship of the Ring, spoiler free up until that chapter. So I encourage you to use that video series as you read The Fellowship of the Ring. If you go on this journey, let me know in the comments below what you think. And until next time, as always, go seek some stories.